Hola amigos, bienvenido. Soy el 10 de la mañana en Redmond, Washington, por lo que es hora de .NET API review. Yeah, that may have been like 80% grammatically correct. All right. Bizarrely, we only have one red issue, and even more bizarrely, we're not going to talk about it today. So we are going to, today, only talk about non-blocking issues. That's called progress. So, without further ado, add overloads to string trimming 14386.
Sure. So I can talk to this. I don't think Tarek's here right now. There are quite a few scenarios where people want to trim the front or the end off of a string only if the string actually starts with or ends with a specific set of characters. A canonical example is I want to trim a slash from the. I want to trim a single slash from the end of the string, for instance. If the string contains multiple slashes, I only want to trim the last one. If the string begins with http:// I want to trim that thing by itself. The existing trim overloads on memory extensions, for instance, are not really conducive to the scenario because they will either trim from an entire set of characters and they will trim multiple versions of those. They will trim multiple counts of those characters. So there's no way to say, like, I only want to trim the last slash. If you call trim end and then pass in slash, like, it will trim every single slash that it sees. So this kind of encapsulates, these APIs proposed here encapsulate both the starts with and ends with check and the trim operation all as a single API. As proposed here, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll save my question for after you're done.
Yeah, okay. So there are two interesting notes here. The first is these APIs, as proposed, are only on memory extensions because memory extensions, unlike string, uses ordinal by default for absolutely every single operation. String does not. And I thought it might be very confusing if we put starts with, or trim if starts with on string, and all of a sudden it's using, say, culture aware starts with instead of ordinal starts with, because that's how string.starts with works by default. It is culture aware. The second note here is that there's also a trim if surrounded by API proposal, and that's used for things like if this span starts with and ends with a double quote, for instance, trim both quotes from both the start and the back. But if it doesn't both start with and end with a quote, don't do anything. So it's useful for pulling off encapsulators like brackets, parentheses, quotes, stuff like that. This pattern also appears pretty commonly within our libraries. Anyway, that's that. Steve, you had a question.
It's purely naming. I don't object to the concepts, but I'm confused by the names. Sure. To me, this is more so like we as you said earlier, like we have defined trimming to basically be here is one or more characters. Take them as many as you can get contiguously off the start or the end. That is not this. This is more, in a similar vein, find some position and then slice to it.
Yeah. So slice if starts with would also work as an API name if that's kind of your preference, because the operations that it's encapsulating are call starts with or ends with, and then slice if it succeeds.
Yeah. The other thing, so something more like that. I don't know if that's great, but something more along those lines the other concern I have is with trim, if ends with makes it makes it sound to me like we're going to perform a trim of some characters if it ends with some other characters. So it's it's like we're going to trim white space if ends with foo. Trimming the thing that is traditional of the if it doesn't sound good to my ears.
And that's fair. And I think would calling it slice instead of trim kind of alleviate that point of confusion?
I think so. It's basically like slice off. I don't know. We have to think through the wording, but slice off ending string or whatever.
Sure.
Is effectively what it's.
In the compare info class, which I have near the bottom of the display here, the compare info class uses the terms prefix and suffix for these, but those terms aren't things that we normally use on APIs directly sitting on memory extensions and string. We could pull those terms forward if we want to, but this would be the first time we're doing it. So that would be like remove prefix, remove suffix, for instance.
I would prefer that, honestly.
Yeah, I agree
Which
with
again,
Steve. Trim means multiple.
We could do. It's just we could do it. It's just this would be a novel application of those terms on the memory extensions and string APIs. If that's okay, then that's okay.
So one
I'd
concern.
rather be consistent with the same. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay, one concern that I have with what's proposed on memory extensions is you've only done half of them, which is you did span, and you also need to do memory. And a thing that we've started doing to avoid needing to define everything 4 times was not returning any of the Spanish types, but instead returning range. And then, so it's compute the range and then let someone do the slice themselves. So we define one method, and now it works for all 4, and in case of string, 5 types. So that's a thing to keep in mind here, is maybe we want to not do any of this and come up with another set of words that suggest that it's producing a range. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to back on the previous discussion.
Yeah. I know.
Happy to... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I dropped the signal for a second. I'd be happier using the same name for the same functionality that exists on another type than trying to remain consistent with the names on memory extensions for something that already has either a different meaning or that. Oh yeah, you get the idea.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So one thing that I thought that this committee might actually push back on is the fact that I haven't defined anything on string here. Everything's on memory extensions. Is that acceptable? The reason that I'm not defining anything on string specifically is the problem that I mentioned earlier. It would probably confuse callers as to what behavior they should expect by default. Because if we say that this is equivalent to calling, say, starts with and then slice, well, starts with on string is current culture. And does that mean any theoretical trim if starts with also has to be current culture? Because there should be a one-to-one mapping between, like, I literally wrote starts with and then substring. Like it's weirdly complicated. The alternative there is to say, if we put this on string, maybe we force someone to pass, ordinal ignore case, culture aware, whatever. That just makes the API a bit unusable in my mind, because now you explicitly have to specify that.
But we can't force it so if we take the current shape where it's an extension method on any of these types, string is convertible, so you can't force string to pass it. It would get converted.
You'd have to call asspan in order to use these extension methods, I believe.
Is that true? I guess maybe extension and implicit conversion won't run together.
Yeah.
I guess that's true because the space would be too big.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. They'd still be able to be called in a static or with static invocation, but as an extension
Yeah.
instance, then yeah, that's fair.
Which is totally fine. Maybe we just say as span and call it a day. So you would prefer remove the overloads and return range, and then let the caller just index.
I mean, again, we can say that we already have trim, and we did it this way, and we defined it for all 4 span-like types, and that will, because we're already in the notion of slicing down strings, we'll keep doing the quadruple definition, which in the case that we want to do it for both T and char means we now have 8 of everything. Then we can, or we can say we can reduce our API and just make somebody have to use square bracket slicing by returning range, and now we write it once and everyone gets the same benefit, just with slightly less convenient code.
Is it just convenience, or presumably that's going to have a little bit more overhead, unless we make the JIT even better? Is that going to matter in the scenarios where we would use these, Levi?
I don't necessarily think so. If you're writing really hot code, then yes, it would show up maybe as like a few extra checks that are irrelevant. But like I don't think this particular pattern occurs in extremely hot code. Or if it does, it occurs at the very beginning because you're doing something like unwrapping brackets from the input and then processing the rest of the input. And processing the rest of the input, something like, try parse this integer is the thing that's actually going to be the hot path.
Yeah, I'm personally, I'm okay with either approach. I'm just pointing out you've defined it on span and not memory, and that's inconsistent for the string-like types.
That is fair, yes.
Also, do we need it on both char and T?
The reason for T was that it was basically how you do ordinal. Like if you get it for free, basically. If you scroll to the right a little bit, you'll notice that the one that takes char also requires you to pass in a string comparison. It's not defaulted. The reason it's not defaulted is because if we have a T overload, and you don't pass a string comparison, that's the overload that gets called. And it always does the right thing. It's always just a straight up equality check.
Fair enough.
So it sounds like there's no I'm missing a where T is I equitable. That would be a requirement on that T
this
there.
one should also be all chars instead of T, but yeah.
Yeah. Copy paste error.
Yep.
Does it need an I equatable? You can get an equality compare regardless of whether it's equatable or not. If it is equatable, it does the right thing. If it's not equatable, it does whatever equals does.
Starts with requires I equatable, so I would assume this would too, since it's basically an equivalent of starts with.
What about index of?
I'm wondering why we required it for starts with.
Don't know. Index of also requires equatable.
I guess I'm wondering if maybe our existing constraints are too strong.
I don't know.
It seems reasonable if you're passing in, some arbitrary value type. I guess it does whatever equal does on spans by default, which is the reflection-y thing, I think.
Yeah. But to answer your original question though, Steve, because this is written literally on top of starts with, I would have to follow the same constraints. I don't know why it has those constraints to begin with.
So basically use the same constraints here, but then potentially revisit whether all these constraints should be removed.
Yes.
Okay, so is there anything we want to do to be happy with this, or do we want to? Are we bouncing it? Because we've had words, but I don't
So
feel
if
like we've had definite words.
so, I can let me act as a foil to my own proposal then. Since Jeremy, you had brought up the issue of overload explosion, you'll see that these, if you focus on just the first group trim if starts with, you'll see that they all take read-only span as a value. That means that you would have to pass in, say, a literal string containing a single character if you wanted to trim a single character from it. So if you wanted to trim a trailing slash, for instance, you would have to pass in string slash as opposed to apostrophe slash apostrophe. And that could potentially add some overhead to our operation because we would have to maybe assume that it's a multi-character string. If we wanted to allow passing in single characters, then like it would require overloads on all of these to take T as opposed to read-only span of T.
But trim is surrounded by does.
Surrounded by does, because the big scenario for that is like I want to remove surrounding quotes, I want to remove surrounding brackets, stuff like that. Trim if starts with, what I saw while looking through our code is that they want to remove like protocol prefixes, stuff like that. And protocol prefixes are multiple characters.
Yeah, I could see to your earlier point in this thread about like not wanting these to have the repeating behavior, like wanting to trim at most one character. But yeah, I don't know. It just seems weird to be inconsistent with the surrounded by and starts with.
Okay. So that would lead to, oh man, we're probably talking a total of around 20 something overloads at this point, once we talk about memory as well.
For each method?
I think total.
Right, because I think, based on we like slice better than trim for we're doing one. Well, we don't like trim because that means
remove.
multiple. That's true.
I was the remove suggestion from earlier was fine as well. I don't have a strong preference.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if we want to go the instance path like trim, then yeah, for remove prefix, we would get 4, and then we would turn that into 8 because of
Memory.
The single character.
Yeah.
And then we would turn that into 16 because of specializing char. So each one of these method groups would have 16 overloads.
Do we have existing overloads for trim for memory or just for span?
We do.
Yeah, I don't think it would quite be 16. I think it would be closer to 12, but yeah, we're probably talking 30-something overloads at this point now. The trim has...
Yeah, trim has memory, read-only, span.
Yeah.
On all of them.
There are 14 overloads of trim. Assuming I know how to count. Plus end, plus start.
Yeah.
So it sounds like from this group the reception is maybe lukewarm, and it needs to be punted back to me to figure out how we maybe lower the number of overloads that would be necessary here.
Yeah, I mean, there is the mild. If it's returning range, then there's the mild perf of you're hitting the great range has an index start and an index end. We're probably returning absolute positioning, but it still has to run through both of those ifs. Then it has to run through the bounds check again with the if, which I guess it would have run with the slice anyway. But you're gonna hit a few more redundant ifs plus another method dispatch. No, you might have done that anyway.
It's not the end of the world. I'm more concerned about like what the call site would read than the performance, to be honest.
Right, because basically, I'll just doodle here in the middle. You'd get header is header of
yeah. And if header is a property, then you're now calling the property getter twice. And hopefully the property getter is O of 1.
Mm-hmm. And it's, a little weird, but it is a thing that we've done in some places just to remove the overload explosion.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, punt it back to me then. I'll play around with that syntax a little bit more and see if maybe we can reduce the overload explosion and also do what Jeremy's talking about. Return a range and see if maybe the syntax is acceptable for the scenarios where we'd use this. Steve, you might actually know the answer to this. Do we commonly use range within the DCL?
No. I mean, we don't have anything against it. We just don't frequently use it.
For some reason, I thought that there was some.
It's also relatively new. I mean, last few years.
I thought that there was like some kind of prohibition against it, like related to trimming, but I must be mistaken.
I mean, if it's not net standard 2.0, then it has implications on where it fits. But
well, I mean, this API wouldn't be net standard 2.0 anyway.
But it looks like the only place that it is showing up is we came up with it as the solution to PIM encoding so that we could have a sensible return and not need 4 different return types to describe something came in and some results came out. I thought we'd done it elsewhere. But
like I don't see it within corelib except for like the definition of range itself and that one helper.
Yeah, I mean, this is every hit. Like, there are 27 total times the word range occurs in all of .NET.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
But
maybe we'll make it 30, 37.
Yeah, we must have come up with this before FDG3 because I'm pretty sure it has a recommendation to avoid doing quadruple overloads to return range. This was also the outcome of the discussion where I had proposed that we did some sort of, like rebind or something on all of the span-like types from the lower types so that we could define this trim once on read-only span, and then you could, source span.slice to whatever the destination span was, and people didn't like that and said return range instead. So
yeah,
this is what we got.
Yep. Okay. Works for me.
Alright. So
thank you for the feedback.
All right. I think that was all the stuff. All right. Do not discard results of methods that shouldn't be ignored. 34098. I feel like everybody has chimed in on this one, so who wants to talk about it?
I can talk about it. I kind of wrote the last proposal. So the idea here is that certain methods return values where if you ignore them, it's basically always a bug. We do have an ID rule that just generally says always capture return values, but that's way too noisy. And so what we want to do is be able to mark APIs where if you ignore what this API returned, your program it's either you have a bug or you're doing unnecessary work that can just be removed. In the past, we had an attribute called peer, the peer attribute, that sort of kind of had this behavior, but it also had other intentions, like that it didn't change state and things like that. And so we've actually kind of pretty much deprecated the peer attribute, and this is kind of a replacement for part of what peer was to be used for. And so kind of the idea is we introduce an attribute that you can tag. I propose to put it on return value and parameter, so that way if you have an out parameter, you can be able to say do not ignore this out parameter. Originally the attribute was just called do not ignore return value, but and you'd mark it on a method, but I changed it to be on return value or parameter, so that changes the usage a little bit. There's an optional message to be able to say, kind of give callers, or when the analyzer fires, to be able to give more indication, like potentially use this other method, or to tell the caller what they're doing wrong, and maybe an option to how to fix it. So yeah, it'd be an attribute that we would add, and then we would add these attributes to any APIs that we felt that we're pretty confident that if you're ignoring this, it's a bug. The proposal is to make this an info and in the reliability category, and then we would have an analyzer that would check any callers that called methods that were marked with this to make sure that they were using the return value. Then I have a list of first ones to mark in the BCL. So collections immutable all had peer before, and we had an analyzer. We have an analyzer that looks for peer, but those were removed, I think, in 6.0, maybe 5.0, somewhere around in that time frame. Stream.read, tuple.create, there was a specific bug for that. Adding things to date time, because if you're adding since date time and date only are all immutable, when you call .add something, it returns the new time, and if you ignored that, you didn't do anything. Same thing for string creation APIs like .replace. That's a pretty common mistake for somebody to say some string .replace h or new line or something and not capture the return value in string. There was one suggestion at the bottom that I didn't put up in the proposal, but I did want to at least call out and chat about.
Should I scroll, or are
So
you just
the
looking?
Scroll down. Oh, the question was about put it on the whole types. It's the very bottom. To be able to mark this attribute on the whole type, and it would just apply to basically every return value of every method in this type. I didn't have a strong opinion either way on that one.
Personally, I'm never a fan of things like that where it just saves you 3 seconds, and now you, as soon as you have one thing that doesn't really need it from the whole type, that now you have to go do the work that you should have just done in the beginning. So I'm always against that.
Okay.
But that's just
Stefan.
me. So yeah, Stefan.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just a question about the intended usage, and I think you basically covered it. So we would only use this if ignoring the return value had meant that there's like no functional impact to the call. Like we wouldn't use this to be opinionated, like, oh, you should definitely observe this task.
I think so. The rule that I had, right, it's at very at the bottom of your screen. The general rule for at least for the BCL or like .NET runtime is it's a very high likelihood that your code is a mistake. Like it's more, it's not like a hint, right? It's not like, oh, well, you should. It's a, if you're doing this, if you're ignoring it, it's you're basically wrong. So like
Right.
in this case, I put up like try parse. Like there's valid reasons to ignore try parse. In some cases, ignoring the result of try parse is okay. And so we wouldn't mark. My proposal is we the .NET runtime wouldn't mark something like int.try parse with this.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Like even, yeah.
Yeah, because there are many people who know if it returns false, it just outs default, and they're like, well, that's the number I was going to use anyway. So.
Yep, exactly. Like, yeah. If you wanted that, then turn on the IDE setting that just says use all return values ever.
Like it pains me when I see bug reports where people are just like discarding tasks that would have given them the exception that like gave them the information. But like there are enough times you're writing a hacky prototype and you're like, in practice this won't throw or whatever. And yeah, I probably don't want to warn for it if it could do useful things.
At first I had this proposed to be a warning by default and was kind of talked down from the ledge to make this info by default. Like in .NET runtime, we would turn this on to be like an error, basically. For our own repo.
So, just thinking in future expansion, because I like the idea. I know we've talked about it before. We get things. I know crypto, which is yes a mess. We have like signed XML. I think has check signature that throws if the signature doesn't work, but all the other signature things return a boolean. And so it's if you came from signed XML, then you might call check signature and like just move on because it didn't throw. And it's like, well, no, you need to ask if it worked. Sorry, we told you whether or not it worked. You need to pay attention. So I wonder if one attribute that has one diagnostic ID is the right answer, or if it should also take an optional diagnostic ID so we can bucket things differently. Like maybe that's silly, but I just wonder if there's value in letting the attribute coerce the diagnostic ID into something other than the general one. Basically what we did for obsolete.
The thing about obsolete, though, is that like your application might depend on the behavior of something that we're asking you not to call anymore. But if this is tailored specifically to things where we really, really, really think you actually have a functional bug in your code, rather than we're just telling you that you're not following best practice, then I don't think the need for a diagnostic ID is that important here.
Fair enough. I mean, part of it would just be if there was, value in grouping and documentation and, so that all the diagnostic, things with the same diagnostic ID are all the same doc. And so do not ignore would just end up at a page that's like the return value of, or when calling this method, you should not ignore the return value. If you believe that it is correct to ignore this return value in your context, then you can do something like assign it to discard. And, versus going back to the check signature thing, or the disparity in method design between the void that throws and the bool returning ones is, in this other method that you may be familiar with, it was exception based, and this one is answer based, so you really need to pay attention to the answer. Don't just blindly change your code. But maybe that's not worth writing down.
Well, I could imagine that if we had documentation for this attribute all up, like that documentation would just say, consult the documentation of the method you're trying to call to figure out why the return value is important. And if you still need to suppress it, underscore equals.
That's fair.
Right, 'cause I assume assigning the return value to a discard would not actually fail, correct?
I think that's how you would suppress this.
Yeah.
Like, that's how other things are.
Well, with the exception of, I guess, would you, if it was put on an out, would you let out discard be a suppression, or would out discard warn of, hey, you weren't supposed to ignore this?
Yeah, that's a good question.
For return values, I can see the explicit discard assignment be a very clear, okay, you explicitly threw this away, but it seems like a different gesture would be needed on out.
I mean, out underscore is kind of the same gesture.
Yeah,
like
you
explicit.
Why is it different?
Well, because an out you were forced, unless there was an overload that didn't have it, you were forced to put something there. And if you're like, that doesn't make sense to me, out underscore, then like you bypassed the system that would have told you, no, this parameter or this out is important.
Except the difference there is you were forced. You had to make a choice, whereas with return values, you don't. Return values, it's easy to just ignore them, whereas out, you have to do something. And so you've made a choice to discard, then like that was your choice, and I don't think we should warn for that.
Fair enough. I mean, it just feels, like out discard is the easiest. I don't know, when I feel like I maybe need this thing, I'll come back and recover it. Is the, if people are doing the rapid code writing, then that's what they're going to do. So the people that I think we're trying to help the most are more likely to discard their outs.
No, I understand where you're coming from there, and I do agree with it to a small extent, but I just don't think out underscore is all that common for, say, novice developers, and I think novice developers are the people who are going to most benefit from these APIs.
Fair enough. I mean, outs themselves are supposed to be rare and only on complicated API, but
yeah.
And also, my preference in general is that all these analyzers, except for ones like, the preview analyzer, where we err on the side of overwarning. Most of these are very light touches. It's like, hey, there might be an issue here, just FYI. And the moment you do anything that could shut us up, we go away. Otherwise, it's just a huge amount of noise. Are you sure? Okay, yeah, I know you told me to go away, but do you really want me to go away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fair. I mean, yeah.
Oh, and actually a question for Eric, since you had mentioned this earlier. Like I know you had mentioned the pure attribute as being an attribute saying this call doesn't have observable side effects. We would still be okay with saying for these APIs, like, hey, this API might have an observable side effect, but you should still really look at the return value because it's important.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like one of
great.
The two method to annotate is stream.read. That definitely has a side effect, but
perfect.
You should ignore. Yeah. So it's just taking part of pure, the part that's like the return value is super important.
Okay, great.
But related to stream.read, I actually have a question on the inherited equals true part of this. So, one of the one of the examples of this of issues with this attribute we've talked about in the past is like memory stream.read, where people, for better or worse, know that memory stream.dispose is a no-op, and know that memory stream.read will always read as much as you asked if it has it. And so it might be safe to ignore the result. So presumably we would also attribute memory stream.read, or we would want to be able to attribute to say actually ignore the ignore. But we don't have that. So I'm wondering if we actually don't want inherited true and actually want inherited false, and if an override has the same ignoring behavior as the base, it would need to manually add the attribute as well.
Feels like inherited makes more like the more common case is that you'd actually want inherited, but I agree that there is a hole there for stream.read and like memory stream or things like it where you're guaranteed.
And the difficulty with inherited true is you then have no way to suppress it.
Right. Where it's like, do we need another attribute that's like okay to ignore that we would put on memory stream.read, and that would override the inherited do not ignore, which sounds terrible when I'm saying it, but because just like the default, if you put this on an abstract message, right, then it's like the default being everybody who overrides who implements it would also need to put it on there when people were casted as that level, right?
Out of curiosity, like if you put this on a return value or a parameter, does the inherited attribute like behavior actually inherit?
I mean, presumably that would be up to the analyzer, because the inherited doesn't actually, like, the only behavior that provides is in the reflection API is whether it ends up getting returned, but analyzer here isn't using reflection.
Okay, fair.
And who knows what helpers we might use in Roslyn that I don't know if they respect inherited in some way, but if we were just doing it all ourselves, it would be entirely up to us whether we walk the whole hierarchy looking for these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think virtuals on this are always just going to be weird, because like the base class or the interface may not have thought it was important, but on some particular implementation it becomes important, and so now it can appear in the middle. But we do have recommendations like the template method pattern and stuff, which suggest basically not having public virtuals and hiding them behind, or making the abstraction or the virtuals always be protected, which means that the public API can say, don't ignore the return value. You can also put on the protected one that if somebody else is calling a protected member, that they should not ignore the return value, but that feels less what this is after. So I guess I'm saying both sides make sense. Certainly making it looks at the method you're calling instead of everywhere up and down the virtual chain of anything that's virtual is certainly the easiest on the analyzer.
I think I'd be okay with that behavior. It's just we would just need to be, we would just need to know when we were applying this to virtual methods.
Right, because for stream, if we did do the defining it at a lower level of a virtual member means that it is applied to all derived types, means great, we've now covered file stream and crypto stream and everything, and we kind of didn't need it on memory stream, but maybe we're okay with it, or maybe we want to build a suppression for it. And if we go explicit, again, that's easier work on the analyzer, but now we need to just slap the attribute in every stream type, which is fair and honest, and but is a little bit more work on us.
It is, although the 90, presumably the vast majority use case would be, even if the concrete type is a memory stream or a file stream or a crypto stream, the type of the variable being used is just stream, at which point the base attribution would be sufficient.
Maybe. I feel like any code that I've seen that uses CryptoStream says, using CryptoStream equal new CryptoStream. So when they're calling read, they're calling CryptoStream read.
Right.
And
It's because it has special APIs on it beyond what Stream has, I think. That's why they need to use it.
I mean, sort of. If they explicitly want to call the transform final block or whatever we called that member, but if they use it in the put it into a disposing, do your stuff, and the let dispose do the process final block for you, then you could have just typed it as stream. So at least half of the code using CryptoStream could just have the destination type be stream, but most people seem to write the type or var, which is the type of the constructor call.
I guess my point was you get a large swath of the world just by painting the base, and then there's value but diminishing returns on the overrides, such that if you happen to miss one, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. I mean, again, or not again, but similarly, the things like the tar reader, right, where it takes a stream, it's going to take stream, so it's only ever going to benefit from the base member version of it. It wouldn't know if some particular stream type along the way thought it was critically important that you pay attention to the return value of, I don't know, position. Then
And presumably, like in the tar case, if you ask for a stream, it's just giving you back stream, even if it's a system.formats.sub read partition whatever stream.
Yeah.
Right, so we wouldn't have to paint the derived.
I think if I apply my general rule to this discussion, where the general rule is there's a very high likelihood that your code's a mistake. If we apply that to the stream and memory stream discussion, it's like that there isn't a very high likelihood that your code's a mistake. Your code's just fine. So I think making it inherited false, and we would have to put it on all the derived classes that we care about. I think that's the right behavior.
Yeah, I mean, again, just playing devil's advocate. I don't know why I keep saying again, because it's not like I've actually said it before, but whatever. That's a warning.
Yeah.
That's not. And
Right.
It's like, well, you changed literally nothing about your code. Functionally.
Well, you did.
You did
changed the type.
change
Yeah.
the type of the variable, right?
Yeah.
Like you could have set stream between 3 and 4, lines 3 and 4, to something else in the first one. You could have set it to a crypto stream if you wanted to.
Well, in a using block here, you can't reassign, but
I'll also note
Yes.
just because you're talking about basically analysis, that exact change has other analysis related changes. When you changed memory stream to var, you actually made it memory stream question mark.
new is nullable?
Var is question mark.
Fair enough. Yet more reasons to not like var.
So I actually just did an experiment in a console app on my machine. Attributes defined on return values, even if you specify inherited equals true, are not actually inherited.
In the reflection model.
In the reflection model, right. But we are talking from an API perspective about the reflection model.
Right, that's what
So-
the attribute usage
Yeah.
applies to.
Yeah, so I think
What-
we should, regardless of what the analyzer does, I think we should set inherited false. Because it's not, given the targets that this thing has, it's not useful information.
Going back to the diagnostic ID question about should we have different ones? The scenario you mentioned, Jeremy, like I think that's where we would use message, is if you really wanted to like distinguish something different about. And then the other thing is, the other usefulness about diagnostic ID is that you can just suppress this one thing. Where here, since like the rule is, like you should basically never be suppressing this. It kind of defeats that purpose, I guess.
Right. Well, I mean, the part of the thinking behind that question, or the motivation behind the question, was where there was in the middle of the discussion of should there be a parameter of, is this a warning, do not ignore, an error, do not ignore, info, do not ignore. And it's like, well, if you do a different diagnostic ID, then we could have a different policy based on the diagnostic ID. But it's something we could add later if we wanted to. It's not precluded by doing it now. Where's this going to live?
The attribute.
Sorry. Is this system runtime net 7 only? Is this net standard? Is it going to impact our contract generation?
No, I think it's just like every other code analysis attribute we've been adding in the past couple of weeks.
Which is we add it to it's part of .NET 7, but the analyzer doesn't care in what assembly it's defined in. So if for our own assemblies that we build that target down level that use this, they would have an internal version of this. If someone else was referencing net standard and wanted to use it, they would declare their own internal version of this, etc.
Right, but I think it's so when we do our ref CS generation, like it's going to see an assembly that's painted with this attribute and produce the ref CS, and then if it's compiling against that standard, then unless we've basically injected the attribute, then it's going to fail to compile. So now we'd be splitting. If we have a,
we inject the attribute.
Okay.
We inject it into the ref as internal.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I guess it's true. We have a pattern.
Like it's just like all the nullable attributes and requires unreferenced code, things like that.
Okay.
Do you have any problems with the methods I've called out? Steve did bring up the stream.read wrinkle, which is a good one.
Yeah,
the part I'm embarrassed of is like the more as we identify them, but it's kind of like I would have to go through every .NET Runtime API and be like, should it be on this one or not?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the kind of thing that we'd either get to as people notice them, or send a bulk notice to area owners of, if there's anything you think is important to mark in this wave, then go do so, and not try a centralized effort.
So one other like kind of designish point that we didn't really talk about yet is that we already do have a diagnostic ID. It's like CA 1806. And there's already an analyzer. If you scroll down, it's like the last section of the proposal, interaction with CA 1806. There's already an analyzer that does kind of this already, but it's got a few problems. One is it doesn't adhere to the rule that we stated above about that like it's a little bit more forgiving about being false positive. And so things like if you new up an object or ignoring H result, the try parse we already kind of talked about, link methods, and it's hard coded. Like the analyzer is hard coded to know about those specific APIs. And so I'm proposing that this would be a new diagnostic ID for this attribute specifically. And The only cases where it has to interact with CA 1806 is the string ones, I think. And so in that case, when you're targeting net7 and you're doing string.replace and you didn't capture the new string, you would get the new diagnostic ID and not 1806. What is the behavior I'm proposing? Oh yeah, the other reason 1806 is in the performance categories because it's more like, oh, this was unnecessary that you newed up this object, or you did a link.where and didn't capture it.
So I missed what you said. You're saying you're going to modify 1806 to not look for do not ignore? I mean, to look for do not ignore and suppress in that case? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, implementation-wise, I think this is going to be the exact same analyzer. It's just going to do the two different rules.
Oh, I see.
And so what it would do is be like, oh, I see do not ignore on the string API, so I'm going to skip 1806, but put in whatever the new attribute or the new ID is.
I see.
But that kind of...
Yeah. I'm not too concerned about it. I mean, if the only way this would be an issue is if you had suppressed 1806 for string.remove blah. And if you were ignoring it, like, I mean, that's a case where it is obviously wrong. The only reason it wouldn't be is if you were somehow using the string.remove call for argument validation, which would be crazy.
String.format is the one case where I found that no, it wasn't us. It was just somewhere on GitHub. It was using string.format for argument validation to make sure the right number of args are getting passed in.
That is expensive argument validation.
Yeah, for sure. And I only found that like in one place on GitHub.
Yeah, I mean.
So yeah, if you were like multi-targeting, you would get 1806 for your net standard build, and then you'd get whatever the new ID is for your net7 build. But it's like, really, should you be? You shouldn't be ignoring those.
But like in the time methods, there are some edge cases where you don't need the return value, which is, oh, we might be doing some time zone work here. Can I add a day without overflowing? Yes. Cool. We can proceed now. No, throw. Like, so the overflow at the top and bottom of these, someone could care about. And that's true of anything that throws exceptions, is sometimes that's all that somebody wanted. Like in the chat, Levi had discard assign of string.length.
Yeah, I think that falls into the, like, there's a 95% chance that you're doing it wrong, and the 5% chance you either suppress either the rule entirely or the rule around that line of code, or use a discard.
Yeah, again, and since the discards would count as reading, then like that's the easy, like, yep, all I wanted was the exception, assign it to discard.
Are there any so I mean I was about to say, the discard here is a blessing in that it's more than most analyzers and more than most warnings. It's like a super simple way of suppressing. Are there any style rules that basically say don't discard return values?
I know ReSharper has one. Like, if you discard assign something that's not a property, it'll be like, that's redundant, right? But that just means that ReSharper will have to react to do not ignore.
Or someone who's using this will turn off. Someone will turn off something. They might suppress that ReSharper rule, or they might suppress this rule, or whatever.
Yeah.
This is already by default just a suggestion, so it's not even a build warning or error. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Everybody happy? I guess. Add the bullet of Good?
Ship it.
All right. Levi, are you still here to talk about?
He stepped away for a while.
Okay. I don't want to talk about it. I'll let him talk about it. All right. Yeah, nothing else turned red, so add delete from JSON async on HTTP client 65617.
It's been a while, but I can talk a bit about that. It's basically just adding support for yet another HTTP verb. The signatures match all the other helper methods from that library, and that's all there is to that, really.
I mean, the proposal's missing a type.
It is indeed. Let me find the type name real quick.
Is this the end of verbs that we would ever want? It seems like we've been incrementally. I think we recently added a patch and now delete.
I believe that's the last one we'll be adding.
Yeah, I'll let you find it.
I think I said that while I was muted. HttpClient JSON extensions. I shared it in chat.
Get patch post put. So it's missing head, but head doesn't have a body, so that that's all the ones I know. I guess we also have the HTTP method. So options.
These are all helpers, right? Like we have a generic one that allows you to pass any verb, and these are all just shortcuts. Is that right?
Basically, yeah. That's the entire library, really.
Yeah. So head I know, or head I expect doesn't make sense, but I could be wrong. And then it looks like options and trace are also not here. So do we need those?
I don't believe we do.
Okay. Why is this not? Right, I don't care. It's actually kind of ugly, like our API proposals are. Hello, Emo.
Hello, how is it going? Did I miss something fun?
You missed the do not ignore attribute and analyzer. We approved it.
Yay!
All right, I don't care. All right, we have HTTP client. We have you. I'm just looking. Are we doing all the right things? Maybe the dev
Yeah,
of this thing will one day let this panel scroll.
Yeah, I was about to say I apologize for this, but that's the yeah.
But for what it's worth, it just matches the signatures of the get verb.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you copied get and
Yep.
because it's like, do we need the JSON serializer? Yeah, context. So okay.
It's copied and pasted. Like there's no innovation happening here in APIs.
Okay.
So we just added the delete verb. Is that it?
Yep.
The only thing I'd say is to put I don't know if this goes in API proposals, but like the requires unreferenced code and those ones.
Yeah, we should
Yeah.
add them.
So for native AOTs requires.
Yeah,
Just-
they've been elided in this proposal, but it would basically echo whatever already exists in the other reflection-based APIs.
Yeah, generally I would add them to the API proposal because I mean, especially things that are relevant for our own tooling are usually interesting. But yeah, if you just copy what we have on get, that's probably fine.
Noted.
Yep.
I think you missed the semicolon somewhere because the color is really unhappy.
I was trying to figure it out, and I think it doesn't like the semicolon.
Oh,
They're
generics,
missing a close paren in all the defaults.
Oh yeah. Doesn't matter. It's fine.
Well, now I know where it is. I was like, does it not like the semicolon? So I tried return null, and that didn't make it happier because it wasn't solving the problem.
I still find it funny that you can break a colorizer with syntax. But yeah. Normally I would expect this to be just at the token boundary. That must be really fancy regex that they're using here.
Say we've let the language get very complicated. In order to correctly colorize, you need to understand the full context.
Yeah, I guess. I think you're still missing
Yeah.
somewhere.
There it is. So I'll give this about 4 more seconds. Okay.
Yeah.
This time I will push comment. I won't have to go recover
did
this
you
from the
close?
video. No, in some previous session I had the pretty printed version up and my brain said I'd hit post and
Oh, you didn't?
I didn't. So I had to
Yeah,
go
I've
recover
done
all the
that.
notes from the video. Done. All right. Enumerable.Order and OrderDescending 67194. Emo.
Yeah, that's terrible. Yeah, so that's a thing that I noticed in my own code, and I've asked on Twitter. Other people have the same problem, and it seems people are generally supportive. It's when you order items, the existing overloads that we have is order by and order by descending, where you effectively pass in a selector that says, okay, let's say you want to sort a list of people, then it's like, okay, which property would you like to sort by usually? But in my case, most of the time when I ended up sorting is like the thing that I'm sorting is already comparable because it's either an array of numbers, let's say, or an array of floats. So I very often end up having that selector just being the identity conversion X goes to X, and it just seemed very wasteful. And so the proposal here is to just have a method that doesn't take a selector. And I think we had a lot of discussion on the naming, and I think we settled more or less on order and order descending because that reads the most logical. And yeah, that's basically the outcome. You just call the method and you get back a sorted enumerable.
2 questions. I don't have a super strong pushback, but we have faced other cases like this before where the API is saving you from writing X arrow X. And I would love for this to not be a slippery slope of leading to having, a whole bunch of new overloads that are, or in this case, newly named methods that aren't even overloads, that save you from writing X arrow X. So I'd like to just make sure we really believe this is adding enough value that it's worth that opening that door. And then my second comment or question is, I'm assuming then or then by isn't interesting because it would basically just be on the T, and so
Right.
Okay.
I think if you wanted to order by something else, I would expect if you now continue with dot then order by some property, that would still work as expected because it's an enumerable. So an ordered enumerable. So I would expect that to compose.
Right. Order dot then by, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
For context and based on Steve's remark, we actually backtracked on the addition of a flatten method in .NET 7. Flatten being an abbreviation for select many x arrow x, precisely for the same reason. Like, we ultimately decided that we didn't feel like it was worth adding yet another API just to save a few characters every time people need to do this. But I still have felt the need for that, for the record.
It's also a bit more than just saving a few characters. This will avoid having to allocate a lambda, capture a closure. It will avoid having to invoke that for every single element in the enumeration. It's all in all going to be quite a bit more efficient if this is an important scenario. I would expect at least a 5 to 10% perf increase, just avoiding all of the indirections and calls here.
That's true. That's the same argument as to be made for the select many case, though. It also avoids the delegate invocation for every element.
Yeah, to me, like, I understand what Stephen is saying, and I think that's the general problem with Link, is that it is kind of fundamentally a productivity API and not a high-performance API, because most of the time when you write a for loop, you get better performance anyway. But I think, like, at least from my point of view, when I use Link, it's very often that I have like 6, 7, 8, 9 Link methods that combine to effectively express what I want to do. And the reason I do it is because it reads better, right? And so, like, every time I now have something that feels extremely convoluted, like order by and then X goes to X, or, flatten I do super rarely, so I don't care actually whether we have flatten or not. But ordering is something I do very often. It just does hamper my ability to actually benefit from Link in that sense. So in that sense, I wouldn't motivate it by perf, but just motivated by, is this frequent enough and does it improve the readability enough, I guess.
Well, I'd also say that, Link isn't necessarily the most performant thing, but that also doesn't mean that it's the least performant thing. There's a big difference between a naive implementation that's always working over an enumerable and something where, we actually internally specialize lists, arrays, and other common collection types. And so, when we can get some perf, even if it's not the maximum perf like writing a for loop, and it can provide a 5 to 10% increase for people writing common link methods, that's still going to make real world impact for even line of business apps that end up doing large selections and stuff. And so I don't think we should say, we don't care about perf and link. It's not the most important thing, but it is still pretty important for various people. And there's been plenty of requests over the years for give us a more performant link that the JIT can fully optimize, etc.
Okay, let me just rephrase what I said. So to me, it's not about like saying perf doesn't matter. I'm just saying I wouldn't motivate methods like the ones here for perf. I would mostly motivate them by readability, because I think, like, if we really truly care about perf and link, then I think probably what we do right now is not necessarily the right way of doing it anyways, right? Then at that point we would have to talk about something like, oh, can we actually unroll the link inside of the compiler, for example, in order to make the compiler effectively unlinkified and make it for loops, right? Rather than adding more and more specialized methods where we maybe get like 4%, 5%, 10% based on the profile, right? But we're not doing that, right? Because I think we generally don't think that is, the most important thing for us to work on. We think like link is fast enough for what it does, and yes, we don't have to make it slower. But I also feel like it's not as an area where we would, be interested in squeezing 10% out. Would be my guess, just based on the order of magnitude where this thing is in right now.
I have a couple of remarks for this. One, we might want to quantify the actual performance benefits of, hard coding an order implementation that doesn't use, delegates. And second, another concern in Link specifically is library size as well. And I think that concern would maybe prevent us from writing a bespoke order implementation that doesn't take the delegate. Honestly, most likely we'd just be calling into order by and maybe cache the delegate or something.
Yeah, I would expect to just write this as order by static x to x.
With trimming, having these methods and not using them, they should just be trimmed. And if they are used, that will still result in less overall IL and code gen than rolling your own for loop.
I think that's not. I don't think that's what's being said. I think what's being said is we have a sorting implementation that has X amount of code in it. We have one of those that's based on a delegate. Are we go for this order method? Is it just going to call order by and inherit that all for free for one line, or is it going to have a whole entirely separate, whatever depth is necessary, sorting implementation that doesn't involve a delegate?
Just have one implementation that takes the T, and then have the order by that takes the delegate pull out the T first, and then pass it down to the shared implementation. We don't have to duplicate code here. We can share it and make it trivially shared.
I don't understand what you're saying, but you're probably right. I'd have to see it.
Maybe. I would think you'd have to see if it changed the order of exceptions, because that would be bad.
Yeah, because order by, to compare, it has to have the two values you want to compare. And so to get the value from order by, you have to invoke the delegate for the left value and the right value. So the sort implementation doesn't actually care about the delegate. All it cares about is the two values that it needs to compare. So the actual sort algorithm can just take the two values, and order by can pull them out first, and order implicitly has them because it doesn't have to go through a delegate in the first place. So it's the same implementation, just, one goes through a delegate and one pulls the value directly.
Yeah, it sort of makes sense to me. So I have a problem with the name. Order is a transitive verb, and it has no intransitive form. So data.order is an incomplete sentence. And data.OrderDescending means that you've ordered a descending, whatever a descending happens to be. Order by fixes that grammatically by saying you're ordering by something. So I feel that if we do this, it would need to be something like order by self, or order automatic, order automatically. Like you need order. To me, order doesn't work. It messes with my language neural net, and if I'm the only one who cares, then whatever, but I feel like it should be brought up. Like, it hurts my brain to read it. It decreases readability because I just went, this method's named stupidly.
Yeah, I guess I don't have that because I'm not a native speaker. For me, it reads fine, but I'm also fine with order by self, I guess. The one thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't do order by with no arguments. That seems weird. I mean, to Steven's earlier point, like, if another option we have is to say, like, instead of doing these identity conversions, we just make them optional and just say null is equivalent to identity conversion. In which case, you would literally have order by no arguments.
We'd have to default it, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think that would be at least somewhat sane, because then you could say, like, okay, that's the behavior that we have for identity conversions, so you don't have to say them; they're implied. And then the naming is somewhat unfortunate, but that's at that point makes sense because when you hover over them, it says, yeah, I'm ordering order by with a null selector.
If we did that, I'd want to do it consistently across everything that allowed these things to be supplied.
Yeah, for sure. Otherwise, it doesn't add value. And I could take a look and like what we have in Link and then make a proposal.
I'm not a native speaker either, but so I set up chat. Is sort the same thing, Jeremy? Like, does that easier? Like, if we use sort and descendantly sort
works. It has
descendant?
it has an intransitive form. Computer science has corrupted the intransitive form to mean go sort yourself, but it already had an intransitive form before we did that, which is why to a native speaker it'd be like, oh yeah, sort.
I think
I don't
the
like the idea of introducing another verb into the Link universe that means the same thing as one thing that's already there.
Right. So yeah.
Doesn't the verb sort also implies in-place sorting?
I guess you can make that argument, but that's something that we already have in the BCL a mixture of, right? So another example would be add, right? Sometimes it returns a new thing that has the thing added, and sometimes it does it in place, right? So I think that's very hard to be consistent with if you have both mutable and immutable APIs.
I think given that we have a precedent of having distinct and distinct by and max and max by, I think order and order by kind of makes sense to expose the two methods as pairs, even though grammatically speaking, it's not the perfect choice.
I would agree with that.
It's fair. New language has to get coined somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm okay with saying, we say needs more work, and then we can look at the identity conversions and see what that looks like, how many we actually have, and how many APIs would make them optional, and then what they look like. But it does still create this inconsistency, right, with distinct by and max by, where we have max and distinct already. But maybe that's okay.
How would you do that comparable? There's a generic constraint on this for comparable.
By the way, shouldn't the return type be enumerable to avoid chaining with .then?
Well, that would be desirable, right? Why would you block the chaining with then? But I think the constraint, you could solve this by just using the default comparer at that point, right? And then the default comparer will either use the comparable thing if it's there, and if it's not, it will just, I don't know, compare addresses or whatever it does.
Well, I think it'd be right now if you had a null comparer. Like, we could say that the pattern is going to be that we take null and then we add this weird shape to make it look like null went through, but because you wouldn't be able to say that in the event you didn't give a conversion function that the t had to be comparable. Because I think it's of t goes to t destination, where t destination is comparable, but now you're saying that t and t destination are the same, and there's no way to encode that in the generic argument when the converter was null.
I'm not following.
Yeah,
What's wrong with the thing that's highlighted right now?
What's highlighted right now is fine.
Right, the proposal of having order by with no argument, well, with the source argument and no
was constrained, yeah.
Of making key selector nullable defaulted to null is what was to key. Nothing would infer.
You have to specify it explicitly.
So now you have to say foo.order by open bracket foo comma foo.
Right.
Yeah, that's terrible.
I think people would rather write x goes to x.
Yeah. So maybe that doesn't work very well then.
One other question I had is, does this need to be unqueryable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in the past we said, when in doubt, yes. But I think we also had the conclusion that that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has to write specialized code for that. We can just have an implementation queryable that, does the same thing that we propose here, which is, pass through to the order by with a delegate that is identity conversion. And then if we want to specialize something later in implementation, for perf we could, but we don't have to. Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is I'm not sure that we want to do the analysis now if the generic constraints are terrible, or the generic specification, because that kind of makes the readability like as bad as the current thing.
No, but I think from the analysis, if it was something like everything except order generally would work, and for order we would need to make the overloads to make it look, to have the same shape, so that we can encode the generic constraint, and that would be an answer.
Yeah, I can take a look. I mean, just going a cursory look, it looks like they all take 2 generic arguments, which would have to specify, right? Which defeat the readability argument.
Okay, so are we unpunting?
I mean, I'm fine with writing it out, but like I think I know where this is going already, so that's
right.
why I'm.
Because I mean, looking at just what's on screen, right? The order by and order by descending have a constrained key selector. Actually, they don't.
Yeah, we would basically. I mean, that's the other thing. We could just get rid of the constraint, right? I just wrote it because it made sense to me, but I think we generally don't have that constraint. We just use the default comparer, and then that will do the right thing.
Right. So I guess in this case it's not a constraint problem, but it is a you lose generic inference.
Yes.
And that's probably true for everything that currently takes a selector.
Yeah, because all the ones take 2 arguments, 2 generic arguments, and that's why I don't think this would be a worthwhile replacement.
Yeah, that sounds like the only possible outcome that I see for that pattern. So, given that the specifying the generic arguments into order is worse than saying x goes to x, we wouldn't do that. So then I think that actually brings us back to what's written here, and then Steve's question of are we gaining enough value for adding things? And then
this one
should we use different names or just be an overload of order by that just takes fewer parameters?
Yeah, so I think if we do it, I would prefer the naming we have on screen, mostly because of prior art on the type, right? Because we already have distinct by, max by, except by, min by, right? So like that makes the most sense to me. I would also not be a fan of changing order to something completely different like sort, because as Steven said, now we introduce a new concept that doesn't seem worth it. So I think if we were to go with that, I think the names we have are the best choices, even though they may not be the most English sounding ones. But I guess I'm generally fine with that because reading code is generally not like valid English anyway. You always sound a bit like Yoda, so that seems okay-ish. So now we are basically just back to Steven's earlier point, is like, is it worth it, right? For that, I don't have a quantifiable answer besides that I personally think it is, and it seems people agree with me, but that's, of course, self-fulfilling to a certain extent, right? It's a productivity API, and when you ask people, do you want a free cookie, they're never going to say no. So I would just say it's a gut feel, and so if everybody in the room thinks this is a terrible idea, then I would say, okay, then let's not do it. If most people think it's worthwhile, then I think we should do it.
I definitely think it's worthwhile. It's consistent with other APIs that provide both an X and an XBY function. It provides some likely performance improvements, although we could get more concrete numbers if someone tried to implement it. I don't believe it's going to require, duplicating large amounts of code. I think we can, with a small refactoring, just share the path between both, as I believe we already do for other X and XBY functions.
I mean, if we're willing to allow the delegate to be null and just do a null check instead of invoking return the original value, then that would be fine.
Yeah, that might be
refactoring
fine
all
as
of
well, but it might be a new function or new. That might be a new concept for the public API.
Oh, I don't mean in the public API.
Okay.
Just below the veneer.
Yeah, because it just calls ordered enumerable, and does it even require the key selector? Yes. So we just move the throw into the call sites and then let it carry on with a null key selector.
So I think it's worthwhile overall. I think people will find utility in this and actually adopt and use it.
Do we remove the comparable constraint?
We don't seem to have it on the other things, so I guess
we should.
Yeah, I think if order just calls order by with let's say a viable implementation is for order to call order by with an identity conversion, that one doesn't take an comparable, so you wouldn't be able to do that. So
what
it
does
seems like
how does order by end up sorting if it can't compare the two?
It just asks for the default comparer of T.
And does that throw if it's not comparable?
No, it will. I think it will do something. It may not do what you want, but it will do something. I think it just returns 0 for all values because that's a valid answer, I guess.
Interesting. That's slightly unexpected to me, but I guess if that's our existing behavior, that's our existing behavior.
Or it might literally just give you the, it compares the hash codes or something. Like, I don't know, but it doesn't throw for sure.
I think it actually will throw. I'm trying to page it back in, but I think the actual compare of t.default will try and give you a compare based on the comparable of t, and if it can't, then it falls back to giving you one based on object. But the object one itself queries for the non-generic comparable. And then I think at the time of comparison, if that querying fails, I think then it actually does throw.
I think you're right, yes. I think I've seen this before.
Yeah, it goes to does not implement comparable, basically.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So it's a very verbose way of saying this has to implement comparable or I fail.
Yeah, it's yet another example where maybe generic constraints are not a good idea.
Well, I mean, we can constrain this one because a constrained method can call an unconstrained method.
But we would have to choose. I mean, I'm not sure there's a lot of the benefit to constraining it is helping the user potentially avoid misuse that will blow up later. The downside to constraining is we would end up constraining it to comparable of t, which wouldn't work for comparable.
So I actually see maybe why we do this now. So if you go look at compare.default, it first tries to get the comparable, and then it has a special pass for nullable because nullable doesn't implement comparable. So by not having the constraint, you can support an enumerable of int question mark. If you do constrain, then you end up having to go to the one where you pass an explicit comparer instead.
Which brings me back to the generic constraints are. I mean, as useful as you would like them to be.
The simpler answer is what Emo alluded to earlier. I mean, that all is all helpful, better, I think. But we would like the implementation of this, even if we don't do it, to be just order goes to order by, and that's not constrained. So why constrain this one?
Yeah.
The real thing is we decide we want all the perf, and then we take a t-comparer, where t-comparer is comparer. That way the JIT can inline the comparison.
Yeah, we tried that with some of the sorting routines that we added in .NET Core 3.0.
For span.
and we still haven't done that.
Yeah,
We should.
We hit issues along the way, and they still the struct still ends up getting boxed, and
then I think there's an issue somewhere, because I know myself and a few other people have our own basically value link implementations, which do perfect code gen, because they're doing generics all the way through. But the issue is
it all got inlined. It all got inlined, or it got inlined, devirtualized, but it was resulting in overheads that were undesirable.
Okay.
If you can fix it, please do.
If you can send me a link, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. I was gonna say, it bothers me we added this API and it's not doing what it's advertised to do. So,
if you can send me a link, I'd be happy to take a look, because as far as I know, the JIT doesn't and shouldn't be boxing there, and we rely on that for generic math and the various vector types in a few other places in the BCL.
Well, to be clear, it's boxing because it's using the shared code path that takes a reference type. So it's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The overhead was when we tried to change the code to be generic all the way through, and that led to unexpected overheads.
Okay. Yeah, if you can link, I'd be happy to take a look.
Apparently, queryable has dynamic dependencies. Because presumably this would be order one. I assume it would call sideways because it doesn't have a thing, or it could use the identity conversion. I don't know. I'll slap these in, and whatever the right answer is will get put there, but it is technically part of the API. So. All right. So Steve, you're the most hesitant. How do you feel?
If we can justify this because it really is the same as the other matrix of max by, distinct by, whatever else, whatever by, and this is just filling a hole, then I can turn my nose aside and be okay with it.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of another by.
I just finish my thought. It's the general notion of, well, if we don't want to write a few more characters, so we're going to add another overload to avoid those few characters, or add an is empty that calls any does not equal 0, or count equals 0, or such things that I get concerned about. We already have 200 plus overloads on enumerable. I'm concerned about significantly increasing that for things that amount to renames or saving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters. But if we can justify this another way, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I feel that the most times that I've used order by or order by descending, it has been x goes to x. Very rarely is it x goes to some property hanging off x, because I usually have, when I've used it, I've had things that were already sortable, but I know at least one by routine that doesn't make sense to do this to, which would be then by, because why would you say then by yourself? Maybe there's a convoluted corner case, but which is you had a primary external sort key and you want the tiebreaker to be its inherent notion of sorting, but that feels not worth doing and would have almost no usage in the real world. But for this, it if everybody who could use this used this, it would mean that in a composed application there would be fewer identity functions just floating around on types to fulfill the lambdas. So it would, in a fully trimmed composed universe, it would actually result in less total code. But so yeah, I'm okay with it. I agree with it makes the usage a little nicer. Part of why I don't use Link, aside from the fact that I'm not allowed to use it in the BCL, so why would I use it in my own projects, is all of the times that you have to write X goes to X. It just feels like you're doing something wrong every time you do that. So for people who like Link, I think this will help. All right. With Steve's hesitation noted, I think that moves this to approved. Congratulations, Emo.
Just for my edification around queryable and like EF, for example, if someone changes their code from order by to order, unless EF is updated, their code is going to not do what they want, right?
I mean, I don't know, but I think also in EF, I don't think this would make sense, right? Because there's no such thing as an orderable table, right? So your object is, let's say, is employees. We have an employees table, and so there's not really a natural order for these things.
Okay.
So you would have to say order by first name, last name, or something else that actually exists as columns in SQL.
Well,
yeah, right. You could select individual columns, right? Select
Right.
from employees, select or from employees, select name, order.
Yeah, I think, but I mean, like you could imagine another query provider that would have a notion of that, and then the question is still, will they just work or not? And I don't know the answer to that.
I would assume without being updated, any query provider would fail on queryable method.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what queryable does, but doesn't it effectively produce an object model representing the query? So I think it depends more what the resulting
It uses
object
link
is that
expressions, right? It uses link expressions, and it basically just says, return an expression wrapping the incoming expression with this method, a method called order, right? The current method.
But that would
So
mean
it's-
that basically we could control that, right? I mean, we could return an expression that would be the equivalent of calling order by X goes to X, right? In which case they would not be broken. They would do whatever they do today, right?
Right. Like if it was selecting a column, then just order would turn it into order by that same column, if they intercepted the request.
It would be weird for queryable to kind of to not follow that same pattern for all the methods. Because that's the pattern for all the methods, is just to return a new expression wrapping the incoming expression with the method call for the current method.
I mean, is that what they do? There's no other methods that have slightly different behavior already?
I mean, there might be some, I guess. I don't know all of them. But that's the normal pattern in there.
What did we do for max by or max and min by? I mean, they're all brand new as well, right? Or, relatively new. So I think whatever we did there, we should do here, if that makes sense. Because Killing the World didn't end when we did that.
Or it didn't end yet.
Growth mindset, that's right.
All right. So next up is add PPC 64 Little Endian to the architecture enum 67428. So we've had this bouncing around an email, and now it's the top issue. So does anybody have feelings they would like to share?
What's our policy in general? Do we have a general policy for when we want to add new architectures? I mean,
we had a very low bar. I think the bar was if somebody produces bits for that architecture somewhere, and they ask for it, we tend to say yes. My question is more like, is this the only place that we have to edit? Because I think we have at least 2 architecture enums, right? One is also representing the PE files in system reflection, I think. And so if we edit here, is there any other place where we need to add it to?
So the one, like, in the mail thread, somebody claimed that PowerPC 64 is the first by Indian architecture we have, but that's not actually true because ARM doesn't say Little Indian. Apparently, most ARM processors are Little Indian, but it's not a given.
We don't support, and Windows, for example, doesn't support, and I believe even on Linux and Mac OS, the support there is questionable for ARM Big Indian. Whereas PowerPC actually ships and runs in many environments and is supported in many like native architecture formats as both big and little.
Right, but it's given that we like if Linux works on ARM Big Indian and somebody's running .NET on that, like it's going to answer ARM because that's the answer that we told it to give, which means we're already in a bi-Indian state saying that you have to ask both architecture and is Big Indian. Like at which point we would just say that this is PowerPC 64 and the Indianness is you have to go ask the other question.
You're talking about dropping the LE in this name? Is that what you're...
Right, unless something about the PowerPC 64 Little Indian architecture is different than the PowerPC 64 Big Indian architecture, like they somehow have different instruction sets, then I don't know that...
I know that there are differences different from even how ARM works. Like ARM, the instructions and everything are always fixed and shared, and it's almost universally exposed as just ARM. But PowerPC almost universally differentiates the two architectures. So my guess, and I don't actually know, is that there is a difference between the two. And that would be why things like the PE file format actually differentiate, whereas they don't for ARM. But I don't know for sure. I'm not familiar enough with PowerPC to give a definitive answer.
I'm glancing around for prior art, like does GCC have a different flag for ARM versus ARM Big Indian or PowerPC Big versus Little Indian? But I'm not quickly finding an answer.
I mean, for PowerPC, at least looking at, like, for Python, they call it PPC 64LE. I guess I'm a bit confused on why ARM is getting injected into this conversation, but it feels like PPC 64LE is Little Indian all the time. That's what the LE means in the name.
Right, but the question is this a Little Indian choice that is the PowerPC 64 architecture still, which is because PowerPC 64 is by Indian, but so is ARM32. And so this is consistency with our naming choice. And now if it's that when we say ARM we don't call it 32, but when we say ARM, if we really mean ARM Little Indian and ARM Big Indian, if we properly supported, we would add a new architecture flag for, then it makes sense to distinguish PowerPC 64. And if Little Indian is the special variant of PowerPC 64, then we can add the words here, but everything else that's by Indian, aka ARM, the bear has meant Little Indian, so should PPC64LE be PPC64LE or just PPC64? Like, these are, the question is does the LE matter, and then if so, why is it little? Or do we want to say PPC64 Little Indian, etc.? So it's basically we have to decide on the name, and that's.
It seems like, I mean, at least everywhere I searched, LE is in the name. Like in the link that I put, like in the wheel package, it's Linux-PPC64 LE, which means it's not. This is specifically not by Indian. This one is Little Indian. So if we wanted to make a Big Indian, then we would put BE, or we would just drop the LE because that's what everybody else calls it.
Yeah, the standard is PPC 64 and 64 LE, and then you see similar in like all the in ELF and.
So when they say PPC 64, they mean Big Indian.
Yes, that's what I understand.
Okay. Because I'm actually asking a little bit of an important technical distinction, which is that there's PPC 64, which is like it supports a startup code of like switch to Little Indian mode, and then that there's like PPC 64 LE, which is I'm a chip that looks just like PPC 64, except you can't. Like I don't have a Big Indian mode. Is it actually a different like architecture, or is it a mode of an existing architecture or a variant?
I think there's chips that fit both.
So I mean, looking at other things we've done here, I also don't think we'd call it PPC 64. I think we'd call it PowerPC 64.
Why we've used kind of the standard moniker for them everywhere, like S396 ARM 64, not ARC 64. PPC 64 LE is the common and public name.
Okay, but then we would hit it should be big P, little c.
That I don't have an opinion on.
And then big L, big E, or do we expand Little Indian, or?
I think we just have it capital P and then everything else lowercase, as if it was one moniker, just like the X and S390X is lower.
Beautiful. So I think I asked earlier, but is this the only place where we have to edit to? We know for a fact we don't have to edit to, let's say, reflection metadata.
I know there was all kinds of discussions about RIDs and stuff in the email.
Well, RIDs wouldn't be an API, right? That would just be a place somewhere else. But I was more thinking like API, because we have multiple of these architecture enums, don't we? I think we...
Isn't this the only one that we're versioning moving forward?
Yeah, now that you mention that, maybe?
It would be helpful if the people, like if Aaron were here or any of the people who had done the in-depth discussion and driving, they'd be able to answer the questions much better.
I mean, on the mail thread, they seem to suggest that this is the only thing. At least that was my impression.
So we also have processor architecture, but is this the one that we basically stopped touching?
Is that the one exposed through environment?
Well, that's the one in system reflection, system.reflection.processor architecture. But maybe that's
That
only
one-
used.
That one doesn't have S390X or anything like that.
Exactly. So I think this might.
On the reflection one would have to be primarily limited to the PE file format, I'd think.
Yeah, when we introduced S390X, so this was the only place we touched. Public API wise.
Never mind. It seems like it's only used in assembly name, and we don't actually care anymore. Yeah, it's only used in assembly name. It's not even used in the metadata format.
All right. That name looks ugly, but I got nothing better.
You also have image file machine and system reflection, and that one has 4 values: AMD 64, ARM, i386, and IA64. So again, we have not added anything to that, so I guess it's fine.
I remember the week or two that we cared about IA64. I'm that
Must have
old.
been a short week.
Long Arch got into system reflection metadata because that can actually go into the PE file. That
Where do you see it referenced?
is that how you say it? Long Arch.
I don't know. I just read it as Loon, but what do I know?
Long Arch. It's in that machine, in system reflection metadata.
Oh, and metadata, not reflection.
Right, system reflection metadata. System reflection portable executable is the namespace, and the machine is
Oh,
the,
yeah.
is the enum. Loom
That
got
one-
in there.
So that matches the PE 32 file codes. And there is a PE 32 file code for
Oh, there's
PowerPC.
Yeah.
But notably, there's one for PowerPC and PowerPC with floating point support. So potentially reflection metadata needs one or both, depending on which one this maps to.
So which
that.
type of
well,
reflection metadata is that?
It already has it.
Oh yeah, it does. It's got PowerPC and PowerPC FP,
Yeah.
matching 0x01F0 and 01F1.
It's interesting that this one's called PowerPC, and that's the little enum. And the one that we're adding has LE on it.
But this one isn't public, is it?
Yeah, in system reflection metadata.
Yeah, this is for
Oh,
the
it's in PE. I see.
portable
Okay, no,
executable file format support.
That's why I don't find it. Okay.
But I would still think that the runtime information one would match what we want to see in the RID, which would match what everybody in the industry calls this.
Yeah, I would agree
Yeah.
with that.
Where, at least my limited industry is like looking at Python, what Python's calling it,
Right.
which is what we have on the screen.
Other than we have a capital P and they have a lowercase one, probably.
Yeah, because we're done it.
So what happens if I'm on that architecture and I'm building a PE file? Would we expect then the PE file to say PPC 64 LE in the PE machine
Yeah.
thingy, wherever that goes?
Presumably it would be either 01F0 or 01F1, yeah.
Wouldn't it be any?
Unless this was PowerPC 32.
Yeah, are you sure? Yeah, that was about my question. Like, are you sure that this is mapped to this PowerPC, or is this a different PowerPC?
Well, those are the only two that the file format spec lists for PowerPC, so it's one of those two.
Or PE doesn't support PowerPC 64.
No, it does, because the Xbox 360 was 64-bit and that was PowerPC.
Fair enough. Okay, so to ask the advocate question, do we want to name it the same as we named it here, or do we want to name it the same as what everyone else in the world calls it?
I think the industry standard is better there. It will be more familiar to people looking at that information.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right. So I think we're done with this one.
I think so.
I say with such confidence in my voice.
Well, it's 12:07. It's time for confidence.
Alrighty.
Did we get 3 issues today? Is that all we did?
No, we got more. We got way more. We got like 2 link ones, right? Oh, one was a JSON one that Eric had, and a link one.
But yeah, we did the link one, the JSON one, the PPC. We punted the string trim.
And do not ignore.
And do not ignore. Yeah, 5.
5. Okay, that's our usual velocity. Yeah.
I mean, I could hit publish and let it count for me, but we never do that on the call. So, yeah. So we still have a red item because we didn't talk about it today. Theoretically, we'll talk about that on Tuesday, depending on when they're ready. And then the 7.0 items still don't fit on screen, so we still have a ways to go on this release. And then Christoph has already decided that we won't get to this one in this release, but it still beats all the ones that are unsorted.
Alrighty.
All right. So, thank you, everyone. We were a bit quiet in chat today. I did see the things that were said, but we had already said them in the call, so I didn't repeat them. And yeah, see people on Tuesday on our same .NET time on our same .NET channel.
Bye bye.
Bye, folks.